Hello, this is part 2 of my DVD collection video where I'm going to be talking about my favorite horror films that came out in the 1980s, but if you haven't already, go check out part 1 of this video. Now, the next movie I want to talk about is An American Werewolf in London. Now, this is written and directed by John Landis, and this is an excellent movie. Now, the film is kind of a horror comedy. I would say it's definitely more horror than comedy, but there are a lot of really funny parts in this movie. But I would say it's more of a horror film with comedy elements, but An American Werewolf in London is a phenomenal film, and Rick Baker does some of the werewolf effects in this movie, and he actually won an Academy Award for his effects work in this movie, and he definitely deserved it, because, like, the scene in this movie where David turns into a werewolf is so freaking cool looking, and very realistic looking too, and of course this was before the time of CGI, and of course if they were to remake this movie now, it would probably be CGI effects when you see David turn into a werewolf, but in this it's all practical and it looks so real. And this is also a really sad movie too, because you actually feel genuinely sorry for the character of David, but An American Werewolf in London, once again, is a great movie. The next movie I want to talk about is yet another werewolf movie, and that is The Howling, which is directed by Joe Dante and is written by John Sayles. Now, before this, Joe Dante and John Sayles worked on the movie Piranha, and Joe Dante would go on to direct movies like Gremlins and The Burbs, and he co-directed Twilight Zone the movie, but The Howling is a really good movie. Now, as far as werewolf movies go, I don't like it as much as An American Werewolf in London, but this is still a really good movie, and I highly recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is The Evil Dead, which is written and directed by Sam Raimi. Now, The Evil Dead is a classic movie, and I actually have a poster of The Evil Dead right behind me, but The Evil Dead is a great film, though. Now, The Evil Dead is about this group of college students who go up to this cabin in the mountains, and they find this ancient book called the Book of the Dead, and they end up summoning these demons from hell, and one by one these college students start getting possessed by the demons. Now, I first saw The Evil Dead when I was 14 years old, and at the time I actually saw Army of Darkness and Evil Dead 2 before I saw this one, so this movie actually kind of shocked me because the first Evil Dead movie is actually a genuinely scary film, and is actually a quite disturbing film too. Like the tree raping scene, that scene still gets to me, but when I first saw this at the age of 14, that scene like really took me aback, and even now that scene really does still kind of bother me, and the film itself is actually a really creepy and disturbing film, but the original Evil Dead is a classic. Now, if you want to know more of my opinions on this movie, me and my friend Eric actually did a review on this movie a couple of years ago, so just check out that review that me and my friend Eric did. The next movie I want to talk about is Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn, which is a freaking awesome sequel. Now, I used to say that Evil Dead 2 was my favorite film in the Evil Dead series, but the thing about the Evil Dead series is each film in the series is so radically different from the other film that you really kind of have to judge each film in this franchise on its own merits. Now, the first Evil Dead was actually a very serious horror film and was actually a genuinely creepy and disturbing film. Evil Dead 2 is much more of a horror comedy, and as a horror comedy, the film is freaking hilarious. And I also feel like the character of Ash really came into his own in this one. In the first movie, Ash was really just some kid who was trying to survive. In this one, Ash is like officially the hero of the movie, and this is really, it's in this movie where Ash became the Ash that you would see in Army of Darkness and Ash vs. Evil Dead and the comic books. The next movie I want to talk about is Ghost Story. Now, this is based on a book by Peter Straub. I think I'm saying that author's last name right. Now, I actually never read the book that this movie is based on, but I've heard a lot of really good things about the book. I actually have a copy of the book right over there, and I'm thinking of giving it a read sometime, but I really do like the movie Ghost Story. Basically, this is about this group of men who every so often get together and tell ghost stories, but basically they end up living in their own ghost story because it turns out that years before the events of this movie, this group of men committed a terrible crime, and now the sins of their past are literally coming back to haunt them. But Ghost Story is a very good movie. The next movie I want to talk about is My Bloody Valentine, which is also a great movie. Basically, this is about this small town that years before the events of this movie, on Valentine's Day, this psychopath went around killing people, but now years later, another series of murders start happening in the town on Valentine's Day. It's a really good movie. I actually did a review on this movie a couple of years ago, actually on Valentine's Day, so if you want to know more of my thoughts on this movie, just check out that review I did. The next movie I want to talk about is a film that I was initially hesitant to put on this list because the next movie I want to talk about is actually a short film which came out in 1982, and that is an adaptation of Stephen King's short story, The Boogeyman. Now, this short film, The Boogeyman, was one of Stephen King's dollar babies. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, basically Stephen King has this thing where a film student can basically buy the rights to one of Stephen King's short stories for literally $1 and make a short film based on one of Stephen King's short stories. I sometimes wonder why I haven't jumped on that. Probably because if Stephen King ever saw what I would do to one of his short stories, he would probably personally come down from Maine to Long Island and smack the shit out of me. But this short film, The Boogeyman, was based on a short story from Stephen King's collection, Night Shift, and I have read the short story that this short film is based on, and the short story, The Boogeyman, is actually my favorite story from Night Shift, and I actually found this to be a pretty faithful adaptation to the short story. And this is also a genuinely creepy short film too. Now, I believe you can watch this short film on YouTube, but I have the movie on this DVD here called Stephen King's Dollar Babies, where it comes with a bunch of the other Dollar Baby short films. The next movie I want to talk about is The Entity, which is also a great movie and is a genuinely creepy movie as well. Now, the film stars Barbara Hershey as this young woman who is being terrorized by some kind of an evil spirit, and she's actually being sexually assaulted by this evil spirit, and throughout the film you feel so freaking been bad for Barbara Hershey's character in this movie, and it's a genuinely good movie. If you haven't seen The Entity, I highly recommend it, and supposedly this film is based on a true story, and I remember before I saw this movie, I actually saw a documentary on the case that this movie is based on, but whether or not that actually happened kind of depends on whether or not you actually believe in ghosts and the supernatural. The next movie I want to talk about is yet another ghost movie, and that is Poltergeist, which really is a classic movie. Now, the film is directed by Tobe Hooper and is co-written and produced by Steven Spielberg. Now, I have heard some rumors that apparently Tobe Hooper, while directing this movie, was high out of his mind on cocaine, and I know Tobe Hooper did have a cocaine problem in the 1980s, and apparently a lot of this was actually directed by Steven Spielberg. That's only what I've heard. I don't know how true that actually is, but there are a lot of scenes in this movie where I could totally believe that Tobe Hooper directed this, but there's a lot of this movie that really does feel Spielberg. Like, it really does feel more like a Spielberg movie than a Tobe Hooper movie. Now, I remember I first saw Poltergeist when I was 12 years old, and I'll admit, I did not like this movie when I first saw it, but I recently rewatched it, and I realized how great of a film it actually is. I think the reason why I didn't like it when I was 12 years old is it really isn't a conventional horror film, because there's actually quite a bit of humor in this movie. Like, the film starts out as kind of a lighthearted comedy in a way, but then it quickly becomes a genuinely scary horror film. And I think when I was a little kid, I didn't get a lot of the humor that was in this movie, but now I do, and now I can genuinely say that this is one of the best horror films to come out in the 1980s. The next movie I want to talk about is Galaxy of Terror, which is a Roger Corman-produced movie. Now, this was made as kind of a cash-in on Alien. It's not exactly a rip-off of Alien, because really the premise of this movie has nothing to do with Alien whatsoever, but you could tell from the tone of the movie and the fact that it's a horror film set in outer space that this film was definitely made to kind of cash in on the success of Alien. Now, this movie has Sid Haig in it, and it also has a very young Robert Englund in it, and also the guy who played Glenn Bateman in The Stand, he's also in this movie as well. And James Cameron actually did a lot of the production design for this movie, which I think is kind of ironic that even though the film is not exactly a ripoff of Alien, it's definitely a cash-in on the success of Alien, so I find it to be kind of ironic that James Cameron worked on this movie, which is an Alien cash-in, and later on he would direct Aliens, which is the official sequel to Alien. The next movie I want to talk about is Amityville II, The Possession, which is actually my favorite of the Amityville horror movies. Like, I know a lot of people don't like this one, and the film is very sleazy, and at the end of the movie, it basically becomes an Exorcist ripoff, but I love this movie, and this really is my favorite of all the Amityville movies. I even like it better than the first one. Like, I can't say it's necessarily a great movie, but I find it to be a very fun movie, and it's my personal favorite of this series. The next movie I want to talk about is Forbidden World, aka Mutant. Now, this is a Roger Corman-produced movie, which, like the movie Galaxy of Terror, was made as kind of a cash-in on the success of Alien, but Mutant, aka Forbidden World, is a really good film, and it's been a while since I've watched this one, but I do want to give this another rewatch sometime, and I might actually do a standalone review on this movie sometime in the future, but Mutant is a really good one, and I definitely recommend this. The next movie I want to talk about is Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, which is my personal favorite of the Halloween franchise. Like, I don't care that Michael Myers isn't in this one. This is my favorite of all the Halloween movies. Now, this copy of the movie that I have was actually signed by Stacey Nelkin, who plays one of the main characters of the movie. I met her a while back at a horror convention, and she signed this copy of the movie for me. Now, don't get me wrong, I do like the first Halloween movie a lot, but the thing I like about this movie above the first two films is the first two Halloween movies, really those movies could have been set on any day of the year, but this film, the story for this film, really kind of has to be set on Halloween, and also in this movie, you really do get a feel for the holiday of Halloween. Like, there's so much Halloween mood in this movie, and truthfully, like every Halloween, this is the Halloween movie that I watch. Now, when this movie came out, basically what John Carpenter wanted to do with the Halloween franchise was he wanted to basically make it into an anthology series where each film in the series would be a different story, only set on Halloween, but unfortunately when this movie came out, it was not a very big hit at all, so when they made Halloween 4, they ended up making Michael Myers the main villain again, and they just continued the story from the first two Halloween movies. But truthfully, I think a Halloween anthology series actually would have been really cool, and I feel like in today's day and age where you have stuff like American Horror Story, I feel like that would have worked more now than it probably did back in the 1980s. The next movie I want to talk about is Creepshow. Now, Creepshow is an anthology film which is directed by George A. Romero and written by Stephen King, and two of the segments in this movie are based on short stories by Stephen King. Now, basically this movie is Stephen King and George A. Romero's tribute to the EC comic books of the 1950s, and the movie has a real comic book feel to it. Now, the movie is 5 stories in one, 6 if you count the wraparound story. Now, my favorite stories in this movie would have to be The Lonesome Death of Jody Verrill, The Crate, and They're Creeping Up on You. They're Creeping Up on You is probably the creepiest out of all the stories in this movie. It's the one with all the cockroaches, and every time I watch this movie, that segment of the film really kind of gets to me. The next movie I want to talk about is the sequel to Creepshow, Creepshow 2, which came out in 1987. Now, this one is written by George A. Romero, and it's 3 stories in one, 4 if you count the wraparound story, and one of the segments of this movie, The Raft, is actually based on a short story by Stephen King, which showed up in Stephen King's collection, Skeleton Crew. Now, Creepshow 2 is freaking awesome. I know some people don't like this one, but I personally love it. I don't like it as much as the first one, but I still really enjoy Creepshow 2. But I would definitely say The Raft is probably my favorite out of the 3 segments in this movie. The next movie I want to talk about is The Thing, which I have both on VHS and and I also have it on this DVD set here where it comes with several other John Carpenter movies, but The Thing is an awesome movie. Now, the movie is a loose remake of the 1951 film The Thing from Another World, but The Thing from Another World was actually based on a novella by John W. Campbell Jr. called Who Goes There, so I don't know if you would really call this a remake or just another adaptation of the book. Now, I have read the book, and this one is a lot more true to the book than the 1951 version was. Now, the film, of course, is directed by John Carpenter, and this is my absolute favorite John Carpenter movie. Now, between The Thing from Another World and this movie, there was actually a film in the 70s called Horror Express, which is also a great movie, but that film was also very loosely based on the novella Who Goes There, so technically this is the third adaptation of that novella. Now, the effects work in this movie is freaking phenomenal, and a lot of these special effects in this movie honestly still hold up today. The next movie I want to talk about is The Burning, and I've always liked The Burning. I think this is a really good slasher film, and I would say this is one of the better Friday the 13th knockoffs, because this did come out after Friday the 13th. However, the Weinsteins, who co-wrote this movie, insist that this movie was actually written before Friday the 13th came out. But I definitely think this is one of the better slasher films to come out during the early 80s slasher boom. I don't like it as much as the Friday the 13th movies, but I still really enjoy this movie. The next movie I want to talk about is a movie that a lot of people would probably say is not a horror film, and the movie is really more of a rock opera, but I do think this movie has a lot of elements of psychological horror, and that is Pink Floyd The Wall, which of course is based on Pink Floyd's album The Wall. And you might be thinking, what am I doing talking about this movie in a video of horror films? But I actually do consider The Wall to be kind of a psychological horror film. Now, technically, the movie is a rock opera, and it's also kind of a musical and kind of a drama film as well. But I do think this movie does have some psychological horror elements as well, because really the film is about a man going insane, which I think is a terrifying thing, and also there are a lot of genuinely creepy moments in this movie, like the scene where Pink shaves off his nipples, and also a lot of his dream sequences in this movie are freaking terrifying, especially the trial sequence. So once again, even though Pink Floyd The Wall might not be a full-fledged horror film, I do think this movie has some horror elements to it, so I chose to talk about it in this video. But if you want to call me out on it and say this isn't a horror film, you technically won't be wrong. But the thing about genre is, I really feel like genre can be a matter of opinion sometimes. I don't think genre is a set-in-stone thing, and also a movie can be of more than one genre at the same time, and The Wall I consider to be both a horror film and a drama film, as well as a rock opera and a musical. But Pink Floyd The Wall is an awesome movie, regardless of what you consider the genre to be. The next movie I want to talk about is David Cronenberg's Videodrome, which is my absolute favorite David Cronenberg movie. To me, this movie really is the best example of David Cronenberg's work, and whenever I think David Cronenberg, I think this movie. Now, I actually have a poster of Videodrome right behind me, but Videodrome is an amazing movie. Now, I already did a review on this movie movie a while back, so if you want to know more of my opinions on this movie, just watch that review I did on this film. But I love the hell out of Videodrome, and in my opinion, this is David Cronenberg's magnum opus. The next movie I want to talk about is another David Cronenberg movie, and this is actually my second favorite David Cronenberg film, and that is The Dead Zone. Now, The Dead Zone is directed by David Cronenberg and is based on a book by Stephen King, and it stars Christopher Walken as the main character. And Christopher Walken, he's one of those actors who, I hate to say it, has kind of become a parody of himself, but in this movie he gives a genuinely good and genuinely heartbreaking performance as the character of John Smith. But yeah, The Dead Zone is one of my favorite David Cronenberg movies, and one of my favorite Stephen King adaptations, and I feel like David Cronenberg did a really good job at taking the source material and really making it his own, but still staying true to the spirit of the book. Now, I'm going to end this video off here, and I'm going to continue with a part 3.